Electric Cafe.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Electric Cafe. Today's video is an album review by a group named Art and Kraft. And the album is called Peel Free. And they're an ambient duo out of Buffalo, and they've been doing music for about 15 years. Really excited to check out the album. There's 12 songs on it. And I'm always up to hear a new ambient album, new music in one of my favorite genres. I've been a big ambient fan since I don't know how far back. I think people that are into ambient music have probably been into ambient music as long as even before they really knew it, because I don't know if I'm different than others, but I would probably say not. When it comes to ambient music, I'm really into background music and sound effects and atmospheric backgrounds and sounds of nature and new age and there's so many different types of ambient music. There's sometimes it can be the focal point. There's sometimes it can be background music. The original concept of ambient music kind of came out of Muzak in the 50s, and then elevator music in the very late 60s, and really didn't get coined ambient until Brian Eno pretty much coined it in the mid 70s. And I've always been a big fan of how it makes you feel and your emotions, and taking you to another place, and almost subconsciously taking you to places, and making you feel different emotions, and it being such a great way to visit different landscapes and different atmospheres and even different worlds and countries and everything like that. It can really take you away to remote places. It's almost like reading a sci-fi book for when I was a kid. It was just like it would just take me into another kind of escape from what I was around, almost just like watching a sci-fi movie or something like that. It just kind of takes you to another world and tells you another story. And it's really hard to trace back my roots of ambient music. As far as like popular ambient music, probably maybe Tangerine Dream, maybe somewhere around like 1982 when I was like 6 or 7 years old. It's really hard to pinpoint the first few ambient tracks I really got into, or artists. It's kind of been ever evolving interest for the last over 40 years. And if there's something that you'd like me to review, my email is down below. Feel free to send me a message and your request, and we can talk about me reviewing your music or suggestions that you have. Could be Depeche Mode, could be your own music, could be Tangerine Dream, could be really anything. If there's something that you have in mind that you would like me to hear and give you my honest opinion on, please message me. Let's get a chance to check it out now and play Peel Free by Art and Kraft. Alright, so there we got a chance to check out each track on Peel Free by Art and Kraft. And this album is a really nice journey. I really like the flow of the album, especially. And there's definitely like a balance of spaciness and also a dreamlike feeling, and them sort of feeling like memories, like long lost memories, and sort of floating in and out of tracks, and in and out of memories. The way the tracks are very short, they almost feel like just glimpses of past memories. And the album is somewhat segued into each other, blending each other for the first handful of tracks, and then there's some that are sort of fade out fully, and then come back in, and then a few towards the end are sort of segued as well, but a kind of a nice balance of both strategies, which I like as well. When I look into the individual tracks, the title track is first, and bear with me while I read a little bit of my notes and just what I jotted down from my first listen through the album. Peel Free starts off with a really nice kind of aquatic background, and the singular synth kind of gets layered and sort of doubles, and as it sort of crescendos, it's a really nice flow as it layers, and then becomes a little bit more powerful as it goes on. It feels really nice. I would think this track is really nice for like stargazing. Like it definitely, like it kind of made me feel like I was like sitting over some like sort of like lake, and sort of the clouds were opening up and the skies were opening up, and it kind of pulls you in, and the anticipation is really high because the main notes or the main melody is kind of repeating itself. It gives you this feeling of a strong anticipation of waiting for what's going to come next, and I really like that because it's exciting in ambient music when you're sort of on edge and not knowing what the direction of the album is. I do that a lot in the mixes that I do. I try to create that emotion where it's kind of a little bit more dramatic, and it's not just floaty ambience or telling a story or this, like, but there's some edge to it. There's some uneasiness, there's some anxiety, and I like that balance of not really knowing where the track is going, but also feeling like it's really relaxing at the same time. And it just kind of pulls you in, and is really, it becomes deeper. And as the track sort of gets to the end, it definitely gives you that feeling like you're ascending, as something sort of gets stripped away and it feeling like it's kind of drifting off. It gives you that feeling of like the sky is opening up a bit and you're being transported through the cosmos. Just really cool, and it has like a breathy sort of fade out, and then it lingers. Then it leaves out a sound that's coming in, and that's going to be the second song, which is called "Wind Blown By." This track is really the first track, Peel Free, is one of my probably top 4 or 5 tracks. A really strong opening track. Track 2 and 3 are kind of shorter tracks, and they kind of add a nice bridge to the story. So the second track, "A Wind Blown By," kind of tribal with the drumming, and it's almost has this primal feel of like the beginning of time, sort of, after the sort of kind of cosmos kind of storyline opening up. It kind of feels like you're back in sort of a tribal, just the beginnings of time, and then it goes into "A Generous Call," which is that's the title of the third track, and that one sort of carries on with the same tension of the first track. It still feels, even though you're at the third track, there's the direction of the album is still feeling a little bit unknown, and which again is exciting. And I do feel like the volume on this track is a little high. I do feel like the album is unmastered. I'm not sure if that's true or not. Not that that's a bad thing at all. I do actually like the rawness of unmastered tracks, but I do feel like the volume of this track is a little bit high. But still, I wouldn't say these tracks are excellent in a way, these two, but they carry on a storyline. And I'll explain a little bit more about that later on. Track 4, "Stirred Pot." I really like how this one opens up and then it goes into Bin of Stars, track number 5. Kind of has like a childlike memory. Feels a little bit fairy tale like. Almost like the album is moving through stories. And the second half of this track it gets a little bit more dramatic, which is really cool. It reminds me a little bit of Kettle's music. If anybody out there listens to Kettle music, a little bit like Sending Orbs label. Kind of has that fairy tale story like whimsical but also spacey storylines. I really like that. I really like the transition into Wave Boat. Like that track feels like a nice transition of the album where you didn't really know where you were going, and then Wave Boat seems to kind of give the direction that the album sort of needs as you're kind of building some memories and building some flow. And Wave Boat, I really like how this track still has a little bit of anxiety and interference feeling, but also a bit of experimentation over the lush keys. And I love the balance of minimalism and then sort of a structured feeling of meandering. So you got this sort of structured feeling, and then you got a little bit of the meandering. It kind of gives me that feeling of like listening to Steve Reich's music, or Mr. Glass, Steve Glass. I always forget his first name. Philip Glass. But it has that feeling of minimalism in there and sort of balanced out. And I love that balance of focused and then also a bit of experimentalism and meandering in it. And I love that balance. Wave Boat is definitely one of my favorite tracks on the album. And then it goes into Face It All, and this one adds a little bit of drama to the album, and then it softly blows away and fades away, which is a really nice feeling. Dreamcast definitely has a dreamlike feeling. And then it kind of comes to what I feel like is the meat of the album, and three of the four longest tracks of the album, or at least three of the four longest tracks on the album. Track number 9, The Unraveling. It sounds like there's a little bit of hail following, like on a windowsill, which is a nice kind of earthly or organic kind of atmosphere to the sort of dreamlike feel, which is really nice. The way the synths come in and the melodies, and they kind of come and go. Very nice feeling of ethereal, but also spacey and a little bit majestic, and but still again dreamlike and feeling part of a bigger story, if that makes sense. It's definitely good planetarium music for sure. This one definitely gives me a feeling of like watching the stars again. It's a bit it sounds a little bit old school documentary feeling also, like if you guys were kids and you watched those sort of sci-fi movies or sci-fi kind of school movies where like you'd watch like molecules form and they would put on these like kind of weird sounds, and not necessarily weird sounds but sort of background kind of sounds and just kind of setting, kind of like a scientific feel and sort of a 60s or 70s feel. This one kind of gives me that kind of documentary feeling of a school sci-fi project, which is really strange enough why I have Boards of Canada up there, because Boards of Canada do a kind of an interesting sort of scientific 70s kind of a documentary feel of over background music, and this one sort of gives me that vibe, but in a kind of a spacey way. Then track number 10, Skies of the Lightning. It almost sounds a little bit like there's a theremin being used in it, but again, it sounds like a distant memory, and it's a nice evolution and sort of combining or kind of segueing tracks into the final stages of the last two tracks. And then we have the last two tracks, Goodnight Spoon and then also True Flowers. Goodnight Spoon is my favorite track on the album. The deeper tones on here are really nice. And because it's I think it's one of the longest tracks, if not the longest tracks. This is one of the only tracks where something happens and then sort of it revisits towards the end, and that's sort of that main melody. It kind of goes away for a little bit, but not fully, and then it comes back. It reminds me a little bit of Dan Abrams' music, aka Shuffle 358, if you know his music. Who had records on 12K as well as Millie Plateau, and a lot of I'm a big fan of his music. And this song reminds me of the glitch ambient that I was really into around 2000. And when I say glitch ambient, I don't really mean like clicks and cuts, but this feels like fragments of sounds or fragments of memories, and sort of them, almost like a minimal structure, but also just like fragments of sound, and it's not like fully focused, but there's like elements of rhythmic sounds, and also elements of something that could be repeating, but it just makes for a great combination of sounds in sort of an experimental way. And then it gets a little bit more gentle, and the feeling of weightlessness, and just really nice spacey ambient, and it ends in the last minute sort of dreamlike again. And that's why the overall album kind of gives me a dreamlike feel. And then the last track, True Flowers, another really good track. A touch somber, but probably one of the most emotional tracks on the album. It reminds me a little bit of like Brian Eno. In fact, it reminded me a little bit of there it is. Reminded me a little bit of Thursday's Afternoon, if you know this album. Not as demented as that one sounds, because there's a little bit of that one that feels a little bit strange in a way. If there was like an ambient album for kitchen music, like for kitchens, or I don't know why the atmosphere in that album kind of reminds me of like a kitchen. Maybe it's the artwork. I don't know. It just kind of, I don't know. It gives me sort of like the tiles in the background just give me this feeling of like being in like a medical lab or some kind of kitchen or something. But anyways, this album sort of reminds me of Thursday Afternoon, this track, and this album a little bit in a way. It kind of reminds me of that, and the sort of the spaciousness in the album, and sort of really because a lot of the tones and a lot of the melodies aren't right in the front. They're not like obvious right in your face, and there's really a depth of the overall spaciousness of the album, where some of the main things are really equal volume to what's going on behind, and I really like that, and it gives me like a late 60s, like early 70s feeling of like an ambient album with a touch of I wouldn't say a touch of sci-fi in here, because it's not necessarily to the point where anything's feeling like unnatural or anything, but it gives me a sort of feeling of a scientific a little bit in the I guess the electronic feeling of math in here a little bit. Like it gives me sort of a documentary feel in this as well. But track number 12, really good stuff. I really like True Flowers Away. To end the album, really nice ending. In a way, this track fills in the audio spectrum probably more so than any other track. It's probably the most dramatic, and definitely ends the album on a big feeling, I guess like sort of like you've gone somewhere, like a feeling of accomplishment, or a feeling that you sort of figured out something, or just a nice ending to the album. It just kind of brings all those emotions and really comes to a peak in that song, and just a nice gentle ending to the album. Really nice. My last couple of thoughts on the album: it definitely has a raw production, again, because I feel like the album is not mastered, but in some ways that raw production gives it more of a I guess more of a human element to the whole album. And sort of because it's a dreamlike, and it's not overly polished or overly done. It gives me this feeling like it was made in the 60s or 70s in a strange way. I would say perhaps if it was mastered, it would help enhance some of the subharmonics and maybe a little bit of the dynamics in the album. But I do feel there's a couple tracks. Again, I think it was track number 3 or 4, and maybe the last track that the volumes are a little high on that track, but overall, really nice flow. The other nice thing about the album is it's pushing about roughly almost 50 minutes or right at 50 minutes, which is not too much to take on in a nice listen. Like when ambient albums get to like 60, 70 albums, it can be a little bit daunting to listen to in one sitting. And the nice thing about the tracks being short and you know, by the time you look at the track listing, you're already on like track 7 or 8. You're like, oh, well, I'm almost done. I might as well listen to the rest. And that I like that feeling because you can get through an ambient album in one sitting. It's hard sometimes to get through. As much as I like ambient albums to feel very sprawling and very in depth and, you know, pushing 80, 90 minutes or even 2 discs, you know, it's nice when you can get through an ambient album in 35 to 50 minutes at the max and feel like you've gotten a chance to enjoy the whole journey of the album, and you definitely do at this album. But I do feel like you know, as much ambient tracks are like right up front and, you know, soundtrack lighting, and I wouldn't really say in your face, but they're definitely not hiding what they're doing. Like, it's nice to hear ambient music like this that is truly feeling like background music and but also good enough to be music that you listen to. Like this seems to have a really nice balance of background music and music that you can listen to and focus on. I'll put it like that. So after looking at the scores of my tracks and dividing it by the total tracks, I get to a score of a 72. But I wanted to add a couple of additional points to get it to a 74 out of 100. Tracks 2 and 3, I gave a 6 out of 10 each, and I didn't want that to necessarily hurt the album score because I do feel like those are good supporting tracks, but, you know, maybe not by themselves. I didn't say they were very good tracks, but I do feel like they help the flow of the album, and I don't want those to necessarily ruin or hurt the album score because of what they are. So I wanted to add a couple additional points onto those and give it a 74 out of 100. So lastly, I wanted to thank Art and Kraft for letting me review their album. I really appreciate the trust when any artist lets me review their music, and I really enjoyed this album. So thank you to Art and Kraft. With their approval, I'd like to share this album with some friends of mine who own their own labels, and hopefully we can get this released on CD or maybe even vinyl if there's somebody out there that would be willing to. If I can help in any way, I'll definitely do that. And you know, I'm always looking to connect people and get music heard to more people, you know. And also put the link below if you'd like to follow Art and Kraft on their Bandcamp page. Hopefully they'll bring out some more music in the future, and hopefully this video helps support them as well. So again, thanks to Art and Kraft for letting me review the album. Also, I want to say thanks for your time and watching the video, and we'll see you on the next video. Thanks so much.